foreign land, a merchant ship, a perilous journey, and a rock to stand on. This is the story of the Mayflower. Today we're here in Plymouth, Massachusetts. We're going to be taking a tour of the Mayflower II, a replica of the original Mayflower ship that came from England in the year 1620. Let's have a look. There were 26 vessels bearing the name Mayflower in the port books from England during the reign of King James. It is unknown why the name was so popular. One Mayflower, in particular, however, would make history. On September 16, 1620, a merchant ship named Mayflower sailed from England and made its way to the New World. On board were 102 men, women, and children who set out on a historic and quite dangerous pilgrimage. Initially, the plan was to sail two ships and split the passengers and cargo between the two. The second ship, the Speedwell, however, was deemed to be unseaworthy after it had sprung multiple leaks, so the passengers were crammed onto the Mayflower, along with their food, tools, weapons, and live animals, such as sheep, goats, chickens, and dogs. During the trip, one passenger died, and one woman, Elizabeth Hopkins, gave birth to a child. Rations were sparse, consisting mainly of salt crackers and dried fish and meat. Everyone on board drank beer, including the children, as it was understood that the fermentation process killed off any bacteria and parasites that may pose a health risk. As perilous a journey as it may have been, that old square-rigged merchant vessel with her castle-like walls safely carried her passengers to the New World. Those high castle-like walls, near the bow and stern of the ship, protected the crew and the main deck from the elements, a design that was typical of English merchant ships in the early 17th century. Those same high walls, however, also caught wind, and the Atlantic westerly winds made for a much slower journey than anticipated. The voyage from England to America took more than 2 months. Mayflower's return trip to London, however, in 1621, took less than half the time. Those westerly winds were now blowing in the direction of the voyage. The Mayflower was heavily armed. Her largest gun was a brass minion cannon, which weighed about 1,200 pounds and could shoot a 3.5-pound cannonball almost a mile. She also had a Saker cannon, about 800 pounds, and two base cannons that weighed about 200 pounds each and shot a 3 to 5 ounce ball. She carried at least 10 pieces of ordnance on the port and starboard sides of her gun deck, 7 cannons for long-range purposes, and 3 smaller guns that were filled with musket balls, often fired from the stern at close quarters. After arriving in Plymouth, the ship's master, Christopher Jones, unloaded 4 of these cannons and left them with the passengers to help fortify their new colony. After many hardships, the Pilgrims first set foot upon a bare rock on the bleak coast of Massachusetts Bay, December 1620. The entire landscape covered in deep snow. Daunting, indeed, was the prospect before them. Exposure to the elements, dwindling supplies, and contagious disease had led to the death of half of them before they even began to build habitation. One by one, they perished. The governor and his wife died in April 1621, and on the 1st of that month, 46 of them were in their graves, many of them buried right behind us on Coles Hill. "300 years later, on June 13, 1957, a full-scale reproduction arrived in Plymouth. Mayflower II set sail from Plymouth, England on April 20, 1957, with a crew of 33 men. As they neared the shore of Massachusetts, Mayflower II ran into a violent squall. No one aboard the ship had any experience handling a 17th century vessel in that kind of weather. Incredibly, the captain remembered that William Bradford, famed governor of Plymouth Colony and passenger aboard the original Mayflower, wrote in his manuscripts how shipmaster Christopher Jones steered the original ship to safety during the 1620 voyage by lying a hull. Quickly recalling this note, the captain and crew executed the same maneuvers and calmly rode out the storm. On June 13, 1957, Mayflower II arrived in Plymouth, Massachusetts, to a crowd of 25,000 cheering spectators. No one knows for sure what happened to the original Mayflower ship. The last record of the ship was an assessment of her value in 1624. After that, she disappeared from maritime records. Several places in England claim to have a piece of the original ship, but there is no historical proof to support these claims. As for those who perished that very first winter so long ago in 1620, well, they were buried right behind us on Coles Hill. Let's take a walk over there and see what we can learn. But first, let's check out Plymouth Rock, America's most disappointing landmark. Plymouth Rock, landing place of the Pilgrims, 1620, Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Interesting that official sign says that it's the landing place of the Pilgrims, because as it says on this informative sign over here by the actual monument, this wasn't the actual landing place of the Pilgrims at all. In fact, nobody has any idea really the importance of this stone. It was likely used as a stepping point to get off their dinghy, which came from the ship, which was out in the water anyway, so there was just no historical evidence of this being an actual landing place, but the rock itself may have played a significant role, as every other rock that they stepped on did. Alright guys, so here we are on top of Coles Hill, overlooking Plymouth Rock. Let's have a look around. Coles Hill has been designated a registered National Historic Landmark under the provisions of the Historic Sites Act of August 21st, 1935. This site possesses exceptional value in commemorating and illustrating the history of the United States. U.S. Department of the Interior, National Park Service, 1961. Of the 104 passengers, these died in Plymouth during the first year. The bones of the Pilgrims, found at various times in and near this enclosure and preserved for many years in the canopy over the rock, were returned at the time of the tercentenary celebration and are deposited within this monument. Erected by the General Society of Mayflower Descendants, 1920. This monument marks the first burying ground in Plymouth of the passengers of the Mayflower. Here, under cover of darkness, the fast-dwindling company laid their dead, leveling the earth above them, lest the Indians should learn how many were the graves. Reader, history records no nobler venture for faith and freedom than that of this pilgrim band. In weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and cold, they laid the foundations of a state wherein every man, through countless ages, should have liberty to worship God in his own way. May their example inspire thee to do thy part in perpetuating and spreading the lofty ideals of our republic throughout the world. About 100 souls came over in this first ship and began this work, which God of his goodness hath hitherto blessed. Let his holy name have ye praise. Bradford, 1650. Interesting to note how important religious freedom was to them, yet they were quick to convert the native people to Christianity. Let's learn more about the complex relationship between these early settlers and the native indigenous people. Massasoit, great sachem of the Wampanoags, protector and preserver of the Pilgrims, 1621, erected by the Improved Order of Red Men as a grateful tribute in 1921. Sadly, the colonists treated the native people as lesser human beings. Before disembarking the Mayflower, they had dug up graves and food storage on nearby Cape Cod, taking anything they deemed valuable. This event, unfortunately, would not be the only act of disrespect perpetrated against the native peoples. Relations between the Pilgrims and Indians weren't always bad, though. The relationship was more transactional, however, and less camaraderie. After losing about half their people during the first winter, the colonists received a visit from Samoset, a visiting Abenaki Indian chief who spoke little English. "Welcome, Englishmen," he greeted them. And after establishing relations, he left and returned with a Wampanoag named Squanto, who was more fluent in English. Squanto was enslaved in England when the plague swept through. He managed to make it back home, only to find his village had been wiped out by disease. Squanto taught the colonists the best way to grow the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash. The corn provides a climbing pole for the beans, while the squash meanders along the ground, keeping weeds at bay, and fish heads were used as fertilizer. The first Thanksgiving, as we know it, never actually took place. At the time, the Wampanoag and the English colonists had a mutual protection agreement. Massasoit, the Wampanoag chief, made an alliance with the English because they had guns and could afford them great protection against the other enemy tribes. The agreement said that the colony would call upon the Wampanoag for assistance in battle, and vice versa. When the Pilgrims successfully made their first harvest in 1621, they fired off their muskets in celebration. Massasoit, hearing the gunshots, gathered up 90 warriors and went to fulfill his end of the agreement. After realizing that it was a celebration they were hearing and not a battle, Massasoit sent out a few of his men to hunt down some deer to offer at the celebration. Relations soon soured between the Wampanoag and the English colonists, however. The agreement that was negotiated in good faith turned out to be a bad bargain for the natives. English law prevailed over Wampanoag government, and the native people were subject to heavy fines for the smallest offenses, which were to be paid for in land. Their belief system was viewed as devil worship, and the colonists were quick to force Christianity on them. Even the colonists' domestic animals had more rights than the indigenous people, as the English refused to prevent their cattle and pigs from destroying Wampanoag fields. These and other violations of native rights finally drove Massasoit's successor and son, Metacomb, to the breaking point. Metacomb was known to the English as King Philip. Soon, one of the bloodiest wars in American history, the King Philip's War, broke out. By the end of the war, in 1678, at least 2,500 colonists lay dead, and at least 40% of the Wampanoag were slain. Massasoit, who was assassinated in 1676, was drawn and quartered, and his head was placed on a pike where it remained for 25 years. A clash between two cultures. Ultimately, though, it was the Pilgrims who came out on top. English law prevailed. Christianity lay like a wet blanket over all other beliefs, and in the end, European migration nearly extinguished a 10,000-year-old culture by way of war and disease. It's a story as old as mankind, human migration and the conflict it creates. Today, more people than ever live in a country other than the one which they were born. The global number of international migrants is estimated to be around 281 million. How the river flows, how the buffalo roam. Migration is human nature, and nature cannot be contained. That's going to do it for this video, guys. I hope you've enjoyed. If so, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a mean comment. Once again, thanks for watching.